Tonight we're going to explore the biblical concept of Armageddon. It's a topic that for most people belongs on a bookshelf or perhaps at the movies. It's an apocalyptic concept that is very quickly consigned to the dustbin of science fiction by much of today's secular society, because the very idea of a titanic military clash with a supernatural force is so far removed from today's mundane experience amongst Western civilization. And part of the problem, of course, is that the very concept of Armageddon has been distorted and disfigured down through the ages as it has filtered down to different cultures and societies. And so people don't know what to believe. This person has that idea and that book says this. The movies portray an entirely different concept altogether. Well, the truth is that the very concept of Armageddon finds its roots in the pages of the Bible. And this is where most quasi-Armageddon ideas have come from before they became distorted. And so if we want the truth, we really need to study the Bible to understand what Armageddon really is. Well, when we do open the Bible, we find that the topic of Armageddon has quite disparate coverage amongst the work of the Old Testament prophets, which makes the study a bit more challenging, because you actually need to have read extensively into most of the major and minor prophets in order to start to build a comprehensive picture of Armageddon. And it's interesting because, as with many areas of prophecy, we find that these Old Testament quotes actually unlock our understanding of equivalent references to New Testament book of Revelation. And equally, Revelation then describes for us more detail around the event. And in the case of Armageddon, Revelation actually takes an already well-developed concept from the Old Testament and carefully places it on a timeline so that the reader knows when Armageddon is going to happen and what to look for. I might also point out that the Christadelphians have done much study on this topic. And despite its disparate coverage amongst the prophets, we believe that when we bring all of these quotes together, we can actually build quite a high-level understanding of what will take place in Armageddon. And as much as I would like to cover all of those things tonight we would like to focus on more of an overview of the topic. And so we aren't going to go into too much detail. But by all means, if you have any questions about the details, please don't hesitate to come up afterwards and ask. Well, turn with me, if you could, to Revelation chapter 16, where we find the word Armageddon. In fact, this is the only time that the word is actually mentioned in Scripture. And as you may or may not be aware, the book of Revelation is a book of prophecy, which is broken up into periods of time which span history from the time of the first century ecclesia in the Roman Empire through to our time today. The time period in which Armageddon sits is a period called the sixth vial, and it also happens to be the period of time in which Christ is prophesied to return to both the saints and appear to the world. And reading from verse 16, "And he gathered them," that is the kings of the earth, "together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon." And so the writer directs us to understand the Hebrew form of the word Armageddon in order to understand its meaning. And when we look at its Hebrew form, we find that it is actually a combination of three Hebrew words, which together form the sentence, "a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment." And so the word Armageddon is taking the analogy of harvest and it's likening it to a process of judgment. You would be aware that when this book was written, wheat and grain was harvested in a particular way before it was used to make bread. And we're going to take a bit of a look at this in a minute. Now, by itself, this sentence has little meaning. It's just like all the other symbols of Revelation, which on their own merit also have limited meaning. But Revelation was never intended it was never written to be read by itself. It was never intended to be a standalone book. Remember before we said that in order to understand Revelation, we need to go back to the Old Testament. And by doing so, we find a whole world of meaning. Because Christ, when he spoke these words to John, he was communicating to an informed audience. An audience who already knew their Bible, who already knew the Old Testament phrases and had already read the prophets. And so in order to understand this phrase, a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment, we need to go back to the Old Testament. And when we do go back to the Old Testament, we find that it has to do with the gathering and the judgment of nations. Now, we aren't going to have time to turn up all of the Old Testament references because there are quite a few, but we are going to quickly run through some of them just to get a sense of what Armageddon is all about. Now, around the time that these prophecies were written, the process to extract grain from the wheat loosely involved 3 stages. The first stage was the reaping of the wheat, where workers would be out in the fields gathering the wheat using a sickle. And of course, in our reading tonight from Joel, we read in verse 13, where the prophet says, "Assemble yourselves and come, all ye heathen, gather yourselves together round about. Thither cause thy mighty ones to come down, O Lord. Let the heathen be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe." Micah 4 also says, "God shall gather them," that is, the nations, "as the sheaves into the floor." And so the process of harvest, the process of national judgment, begins with the reaping and the gathering of the wheat. But what is this judgment for? Well, if we go back a few verses in Joel to chapter 3 and verse 2, it's because the nations have collectively scattered Israel amongst the nations and parted their land. Well, the second stage of harvest is where the wheat is collected and placed on the threshing floor where the sheaves would be crushed. And in those times, the crushing would take place on the top of a rock or on a hilltop where perhaps there would be more wind, and there the sheaves would be laid out while the oxen dragged heavy objects over them. And in this process, the pressure of the cart would cause the chaff to separate from the grain. And throughout the prophets, in the context of judging the nations, God uses this idea of threshing. And just some examples, as we've done before, the nations are broken into pieces and become like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, says Daniel 2, talking of that time of Armageddon. Micah 4, "Arise and thresh." Joel 3, as we read tonight, "Multitudes in the valley of threshing." Habakkuk 3, "In wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations." And of course, all of those verses are in the context of the ultimate national judgment, because the nations have sought to divide and destroy Israel. Well, the third part of this process was the winnowing and sieving, where the grain was ultimately and completely separated from the stalk, husk, and any other seeds. And mostly this process involved filtering and wind to separate the grain. This also is used to describe the judgment of the nations, but in particular, their futility in the face of the power of Christ and his armies, because there is nothing more powerless than dust in the wind. It's completely subjected to the slightest breeze, and that is the image of helplessness that the prophets describe of futility of the nations who come against Israel. Just a couple of examples. Isaiah 30. "Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar to sift the nations with the sieve of futility." And Isaiah 7. "God will rebuke them, and they will flee far away, chased like the chaff on the mountains before the wind and whirling dust before the storm." Absolute helplessness in the face of God's anger. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? That in this day and age, with the weaponry that mankind has has at his disposal, that these weapons of war will be effectively nothing more than chaff in God's hands. The armies of the nations who oppose Israel will have weapons which will be the cutting edge of man's technological capability. They'll be unparalleled in power and precedent. But when they meet Christ, those instruments of death which seem so impenetrable to us now will be no more effective than the chaff that is subjected to the wind. And this is really the meaning behind the judgment of Armageddon as described in the prophets. Now, you would agree with me that the suggestion that Armageddon, the nations and the armies that come against Israel, will be utterly destroyed is quite a substantial claim by any measure of the imagination. And I think, therefore, that some time is warranted substantiating this claim before we try and understand how it will bring about peace. We've seen that the Bible talks about Armageddon. We might ask the question, does that really mean that Armageddon will happen? Is Armageddon somehow just an allegory? How can we possibly suggest with unmitigated certainty that it will happen? Well, in order to understand that question, we need to go back in time. When describing Armageddon, the prophets have given us an idea of some of the events which will take place before and after Armageddon. And so if we really want to test the veracity of those claims to Armageddon, we need to see what has been prophesied to happen and if any of it has already come to pass. Well, Scripture tells us that just prior to Armageddon, there is at least two major events that will happen. The first is the gradual dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And the second is the return of Israel to their own land. And we're going to briefly explore these two events in a little more detail. Well, the first event is the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the last Muslim caliphate to have the status of an empire, and it lasted for a significant period of time throughout history, starting in 1299 AD and lasting through till 1922, which is a significant period of time. Now, if we come back to Revelation 16, we find that the time period in which Armageddon is placed is in the time period of the sixth vial, as we mentioned earlier. The sixth vial begins with the drying of the Euphrates in verse 12 and ends with Armageddon in verse 16. If we just quickly read from that verse, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates. The water thereof was dried up, and he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon." And so in order to understand this period of time, we need to ask, if Armageddon ends the sixth vial, what is it that starts it? What is the drying of the Euphrates? Well, we believe that the drying of the Euphrates, which begins in the sixth vial, which begins the sixth vial, is representative of the gradual breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, as we just briefly looked at. And there's a few reasons why we believe this, but primarily because rivers can be a biblical symbol of political and national strength. And so in the context of the previous vials, this must be referring to whatever power dominated the Euphratean region around that time. So the breakup of the Ottoman Empire is the first event that ultimately results in Armageddon. Well, this interpretation of Revelation is not new. In fact, 70 years prior to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, our Christadelphian brethren and sisters were watching and waiting for this to happen with keen anticipation. To quote one writing, written roughly 70 years prior to 1922, John Thomas, who was a Christadelphian, said this: "The Ottoman Empire will be dried up, and the sick man must die in spite of all their efforts to save him." And so this is an event which was prophesied to happen, and it did take place. And our brethren and sisters at the time looked forward and waited to see the fulfilment of this gradual process, but they never quite lived to see it happen as we have. On the other hand, we look back now and we have the hindsight of history spread before our eyes. We can see what many of our brethren and sisters only dreamt of seeing. They knew it would happen someday, but they didn't have the chance to see it in their time. But we have to be careful because hindsight doesn't guarantee foresight. While we have the benefit of witnessing prophecies like these come to pass, these same prophecies tell us unequivocally that Armageddon is about to happen. And so we can't become complacent. Well, the next event that will result in Armageddon is the return of Israel to their own land. And this is something that we could substantiate a few times over in Scripture, because unlike the drying of the Euphrates, this particular prophecy is not a symbol of Revelation, which is a book of symbol, but it is instead a prophecy that is quite literal. And so we have a couple of quotes, just to cover this briefly. In Ezekiel 37 and 38, it talks about both the establishment of the state of Israel. In Ezekiel chapter 37, it says, God says, I shall place you, Israel, in your own land, and then you shall know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it. And later on, in chapter 38 and 39, God says, speaking to Gog, that you and many nations with you will advance against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. In Joel 3, as we read tonight, in those days and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and put them on trial. So Scripture is quite clear. Once Israel is back in the land, after a period of time, there would be a coalition of nations who would come into their land intent on destroying Israel. But of course, Israel has to be in the land in the first place before this takes place. Well, when we go back in time, we find that for the first time in over 2,000 years, the Jewish people regathered in the land that was formerly known as Palestine, with an established state in 1948. That was 68 years ago. And over the period of 2 millenniums, the Jews had been rejected by nation after nation. They experienced ethnic cleansing at an unprecedented scale, seen in horrific events like the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust. And yet they survived over 2,000 years and were re-established in their own land, just as Joel and Ezekiel had prophesied. And at the time of their return, the Christadelphians were truly in awe, because after reading the prophets, we had been waiting for this also to happen. In fact, 100 years prior to the establishment of a Jewish state, John Thomas wrote quite extensively on this topic, describing and studying the writings of the prophets. Of course, 100 years prior to 1948, Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and it was virtually derelict. The Muslim Ottomans were opposed to the idea of a Jewish state, and so any suggestion at this point that the Jews could inhabit Palestine would have opposed common sense. In fact, many Jews at the time actually believed it to be a ludicrous proposition. And yet in the face of an obvious absence of Israel from their own land, there was no hesitation by the Christadelphians to accept the sure word of prophecy and believe that Israel would one day return to their own land. And just to demonstrate some of the writings of John Thomas around this time, he says, the pre-adventual colonisation of Palestine would be on purely political terms. And it's interesting, 100 years later, when Israel was established in their land, the words of the first Prime Minister of Israel very much reflected that thinking when he said, after being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. This right is a natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. Purely political principles, said Brother Thomas. In fact, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion went on to say during the declaration that in recent decades they returned in their masses, pioneers, defiant, returnees and defenders, and they made deserts bloom. They revived the Hebrew language. They built villages and towns and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants and aspiring towards independent nationhood. And again, Brother Thomas said that this also would happen in amazing detail and accuracy when he said that they will immigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth under the efficient protection of the British power. And we know that as history unfolded, the Jews did indeed become agriculturalists. And in fact, still today, they lead the nations in agricultural science. Not only did Brother Thomas accurately predict the agricultural pioneering of Israel, but also that Israel would be established with the support of Britain. And this also is exactly what happened. As history unfolded, we saw the British Empire drive the Ottoman Empire back into Turkey and ultimately give Palestine back to the Jews. All of these things came to pass just as the Old Testament prophets had predicted. But it didn't finish there, because these same prophecies that predicted these things, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the establishment of the State of Israel, these same prophecies also predict Armageddon, just as we saw earlier. I'm going to take the liberty of quoting from Brother Thomas once more, only to demonstrate that this is nothing new. These prophecies have been in the Bible for some time, and they've only just begun to come to pass in the 20th century. And so, quoting from Brother Thomas in 1848 on the topic of the restoration of the Jews, he says, "The truth is that there are two stages in the restoration of the Jews. The first is before the Battle of Armageddon, and the second after it." And so we've seen the first restoration, haven't we? The Old Testament prophets told us that it would happen. And as a Christadelphian, I look back to the time of some of our brethren, like Brother Thomas, and I know that they would have been elated to have lived in our time, ecstatic to see these things come to pass. And what's more, in 2015, we saw Russia move into Syria. They would have longed to see these things come to pass. They knew that it would happen, but they did not live to see the day. And so, as surely as the state of Israel has been revived and those prophecies have come to pass, we can be just as sure that the judgment of the nations is going to happen. And if we take a look at the world around us now, is this really a surprise? You know, I started by saying that for many in the secular world, that the concept of Armageddon is perhaps seen as a bit fantastic. But the truth is that many military and geopolitical analysts are very worried that the world is descending into an era of unprecedented crisis. It's happening slowly but surely in the financial world. It's happening across world economies as debt is spiralling out of control. We've just had the Brexit. And in about a week's time we have the US elections, where Trump, who expresses the vulgarity of the basis of man's instincts, who issues threats of war at the drop of a hat, could well become the most powerful man in the world. If not Trump, then Hillary, whom the Russians particularly dislike. And just how close we are to Armageddon is just as apparent when we look at Russia, where we have the key decision makers viewing the world through an increasingly militant lens. We're going to focus on Russia briefly because the prophets tell us that the leader of the Confederacy who comes against Israel is Russia. Ezekiel 38, for example, talks about Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which describe the region of Russia, the nation which leads the invasion of Israel. However, to begin with, this invasion is not just about Israel. In fact, Daniel chapter 11 tells us that Turkey will be invaded along with Egypt and many other nations. And when we look at Russia and its behaviour over the last decade, we can see that once again it's emerging as a power to be reckoned with. But this time it doesn't have its fingers in European pie. This time Russian interests are in the Middle East. And so if we look at the patterns of the Russian wars under Putin's administration, we can see that pattern of conquest or occupation is heading further and further south. You might have heard over the last couple of weeks that Russia has now decided to establish a permanent base in Syria, which will enable them to scale up military operations very quickly in the Middle East if they so desire. And at the same time, the Russian parliament have approved an unlimited number of Russian troops in Syria. And so you would think, after annexing the territory of Crimea, actually what I might do is just jump back just so I can quickly run over those lists of nations that Russia has gone down. So when Putin first came into power, he was involved in a war with Chechnya, which they eventually took. They took Dagestan eventually. They invaded Georgia. There's been an ongoing war in Ukraine subsequent to that. And Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. And of course, we've seen the war in Syria that has been ongoing. And so there's that southerly trend which is happening. And you would think after annexing the territory of Crimea that Russia or Putin might try and stay low for a while, perhaps try and be a bit surreptitious to avoid international condemnation. Well, no, only the last month, in fact, on the territory that they had just annexed, Russia invited the international media, including US media, into Crimea and allowed them to capture the following footage, sending a clear signal to the rest of the world. We're just going to play this short clip.
Moscow putting on a huge show of force. War games from land, air, and sea. In Crimea, the territory Russia annexed from Ukraine a little over 2 years ago.
The Russians are sending a very clear message with these large-scale and complex military drills. Their forces are entrenched here in Crimea, and they're ready to fight any time.
The maneuvers are called Kafkas 2016 and take place not only in Crimea, but in Russia's entire southern military district right on the border with Ukraine. The drills involve more than 12,000 soldiers, dozens of fighter jets flying mock dogfight missions, strike aircraft hitting ground and sea targets, and land forces in an amphibious assault. Still, the Defense Ministry spokesman insists it's not a provocation. This is not at all a provocation, he says. I want to stress that this is a planned event. We announced these drills last November. The troops have been preparing for a long time. But they come at a time of heightened tensions with the US and NATO over the annexation of Crimea and other issues. The Russian Air Force intercepted a US P-8 naval aircraft in the region just as the drills were getting underway. And only 3 weeks ago, Russia accused Ukraine of trying to smuggle operatives into Crimea for sabotage operations, a claim Kiev denies. The Kafkas military drills will likely cause more unease in Ukraine and Eastern European NATO member states. Russia's military chief of staff says the initial assessment is that they went smoothly. We need to fully analyze everything, he says, but these drills were very beneficial to the southern military district and for the troops from other districts involved as well. With Russia and the West at odds over Syria and Ukraine, Moscow is continuing to advance and refine its armed forces for all the world to see. Fred Pleitgen, CNN at the Opok military base in Crimea.
Okay. So, just as the CNN anchor said, we can see Russia flexing its muscles for the world to see. It's a trend of aggression which has been pushing south since the beginning of Putin's presidency. It's falling over. I'm going to have to hold it here. Perhaps not. So that trend is perhaps not intentional at this point on behalf of Putin's administration, but of course with God's word in hand and with Israel now in their land, we can see other forces at play. Well, of the list of countries which we saw Putin had invaded or occupied during his administration, the invasion of Crimea was particularly interesting. When Putin invaded Crimea, his popularity in Russia went through the roof, and he was lauded as a hero. The Western world were taken by complete surprise, and at the time the BBC reported that the annexation of Crimea was the smoothest invasion of modern times. It was over before the outside world realised it had even started. And of course some of us might remember that when it happened, Putin denied any such invasion was taking place. In fact, the same happened with Georgia. He denied that too, and Dagestan. In all cases, including Crimea, he eventually confessed to having been involved in the invasion, and a few hours to a couple of days later, he would completely reverse his position. In the case of Crimea, this is what he said. In the hearts and the minds of people, Crimea always has been and remains an inseparable part of Russia. And so within days, Putin goes from denying any involvement in Crimea to saying, well, actually, Crimea has always been a part of Russia. Now that's quite a grand territorial statement. How about this one? Moscow and Petersgrad, the city of Constantine, these are the capitals of the Russian kingdom, from the Nile to the Neva, from the Elbe to China, from the Volga to the Euphrates, from the Ganges to the Danube. This is the Russian kingdom, and let it be forever, just as the Spirit foretold and Daniel prophesied. Those are the words of a 19th century Russian poet who has helped define the nationalism that characterises Russia today. Extraordinary words. Tuchev, who was the poet, was a notable Russian poet in the 19th century, as we just said, and you can, if you look up Russian nationalism on Google today, you'll find that this is one of the first quotes to appear. Now, I know that that's quite a crude way of demonstrating the importance of this particular poem in Russia, but the truth is that poems like these are prolific in Russia. Well, Tuchev wasn't too scared to refer to the writings of Daniel, was he? And it's interesting to note that the city of Constantine is featured, which Daniel 11 says will be taken by Russia. In fact, it also includes Turkey and Egypt, which Daniel 11 says will be taken. Perhaps the most interesting of all is if you map out this territory, it includes much of its Russia's Byzantine Roman heritage on one side and its Greek Seleucid heritage on the eastern side. And right in the very centre, the poem lays claim to Israel and Jerusalem forever, just as Daniel prophesied, according to the poem. Well, how prolific are these nationalistic beliefs in Russia, you say? Well, Stephen Lee Myers, lead Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, said this, that from 2014 onwards, Putin had begun to cast his leadership in a broader historical context. He meant to restore something much older, much richer and deeper, the idea of the Russian nation, the imperium of the Third Rome, charting its own course, indifferent to the imposition of foreign values. It was an old Russian idea, and he found the model for it in the history books he was said to favour. What Myers is referring to is a time in Putin's presidency when many people noted a marked change towards the idea of a new Russian nationalism. A nationalism which sees itself as a resurrected form of the Roman Empire. And of course, many of you will know that of the image of Nebuchadnezzar, where in Daniel chapter 2, a passage that we quoted earlier, there is a little stone that grinds the image to powder. That image is a manifestation of the kingdom of men. And of course, the last manifestation of the kingdom of men, prior to the coming of Christ, is a resurrected form of the Roman Empire. It still has Roman elements because it's made of both clay and iron. And here we have a manifestation of that power, posturing as a latter-day manifestation of Rome, with Emperor Putin at the helm. Well, it was in that same year, when in 2014, when we began to see that marked change in Putin's presidency towards nationalism, that the Kremlin distributed 3 ideological books to key decision makers across Russia, including the regional governors and senior members of the Russia United Party. These ideologies contained within these books are simply astounding. They range from Russia taking back Constantinople to the Russian Orthodoxy unifying with Roman Catholicism, through to anti-Zionism, even anti-Semitism, and many other aspirations which would not surprise a student of prophecy. We only have time to take a brief look at one of those books, one of those 3 books that were distributed to Russian leadership tonight, and that's a book called Our Tasks, which was written by a 19th century philosopher named Ivan Ilyin, who Putin virtually idolises. And he said, on May the 14th, 1948, was a day of celebration and jubilation to the Jewish masses all over the world, and a day of sorrow and mourning for all those who knew how far the implementation of the Zionist idea departed from the goal. The existence of Israel is not only achieved, but full of mortal danger. There are religious fanatics who want Greater Israel to extend from the Nile to the Euphrates and be completed in a final nationalist, imperialist, terrorist act. And of course, he's quite right when he maps out that geography. In fact, he is unwittingly describing the boundaries of Israel and the kingdom after Armageddon. This man tried to assure his contemporaries that it was not anti-Semitic. They quickly discarded any notion of that being the case when they found that Ivan also considered Nazism to be a positive phenomenon that, with some modifications and adjustments, could serve as a model for future Russia. Nazism. And this is a man who Putin constantly refers to and idolises in his nationalist speeches. Well, another more contemporary influence is Russia's second most influential man in Russia today, and that is the vice chairman of the Russian parliament, Zhirinovsky. Zhirinovsky is fiercely nationalist and notoriously anti-Semitic. He's well known for making brash and confrontational statements. For example, when Turkey shot down a Russian warplane, Zhirinovsky, along with a number of others in the Russian parliament, called for an invasion of Turkey. Zhirinovsky, in particular, demanded that Russia detonate a nuclear bomb on the Bosphorus in Turkey to create a 10-metre high tsunami wave that would wipe out at least 9 million Muslims in Istanbul. And that was reported quite widely in the media. He's a very fierce man who reflects the broader mindset of the right-wing parliament. And on the right there you can see the Time magazine cover for July 1944, which describes Zhirinovsky as the zealot who would make Russia dangerous again. Well, Zhirinovsky has written a book which has become very popular in Russia, and it's called The Last Push Southward. It essentially talks about a Russian invasion of the entire Middle East, from Turkey to Afghanistan. And for those who know their history, that is virtually the territory of the King of the North in Daniel chapter 11. His book talks about the time when the bells of the Orthodox Church will ring from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And ultimately he talks about the Christian world unifying in Jerusalem. Very similar to the kind of literature that we've already seen tonight, showing Russia's ambitions in the Middle East. More recently, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, Zhirinovsky said in an interview with Reuters that if Hillary was voted in, she would be the last US president to exist on Earth, and that war would break out. And that was actually on CNN, broken by Reuters. So these are amazing statements to hear from such an influential man in Russia, and especially from someone who has Putin's ear. Of course, the only thing stopping the second most influential man in Russia detonating a nuclear bomb on Turkey or invading the Middle East is the first most powerful man, Putin, for now at least. And so we can see that Russia is carving out plans for the Middle East, beginning with Turkey. And so it's amazing to see these things etched into Russian culture and bubbling over in today's Russian society. Another example is the teaching of what they believe will be the coming of the Antichrist, who only Russia, Holy Russia mind you, will be able to destroy. A book called Putinism, which was released a couple of years ago, which summarises Russian culture, says their eschatological preaching about the coming of the Antichrist, the appearance of a false Messiah, and the end of days, the final struggle between the forces of Christ and Satan, in which Holy Russia, chosen by God, would play a central, decisive role. These and other elements of paranoia have figured prominently at both the centre and the periphery of the Orthodox Church. To achieve its victorious mission, Holy Russia would have to establish a powerful empire, this being the meeting point of the forces of the Orthodox Church and Russian nationalism. And so this is saying that many Russians believe that there will be an Antichrist that appears in Israel. And when that does happen, it's up to Russia to destroy that Antichrist. And of course, for students of prophecy, there will be a time after Russia has invaded many nations in the Middle East, that we understand, when suddenly Russia will hear reports of something suspicious in Israel. We know that from Daniel chapter 11 and verse 44, which says, "But reports from the east and north will alarm him." And he, that is the king of the north, Russia, "and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many." And so the Russians will hear that Christ is in Israel. And what do you think they'll do? How do you think they'll respond? They will identify the Lord Jesus Christ as the Antichrist, because that is what is etched into their religion and culture. And so they will set out in a great rage, intent on destroying and annihilating Christ, who they believe is the Antichrist, and also the saints in Jerusalem. And there they'll meet their fate. And so we can see that in many ways the odds are stacking up against Israel. We can see that Russia already has territorial ambitions which extend throughout the Middle East and include Israel, Turkey and Egypt. We can see already that anti-Semitism is emerging as an influence in Russia, And we can also see that Russia expects an antichrist to appear in Israel. It won't be long until we see Russia eye off the resources and of the nation of Israel, their gas, their oil, their advances in technology and farming, and they'll want a cut of it. And at that point, their focus will be on the destruction of Israel. Ezekiel 38 says that Gog will devise an evil scheme to seize, spoil and carry off plunder. Let her be defiled, he says, let our eyes gloat over Zion. Talking of Zion's demise. And he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Daniel 11, as we just read. And so Russia will lead this confederacy into war with Israel. And it'll be right at that very moment when Russia and the nations believe that they are about to crush Jerusalem for good, that Christ will appear and utterly crush the invading forces. Isaiah 34 details the extent to which God will annihilate the invading forces of Israel. It's quite an extensive chapter. It talks about some of the details of Armageddon, and it's worth reading afterwards if you get a chance. The scene set by all of the prophets is that God will waste no time in destroying those armies from the face of the earth. They will have committed the ultimate national offence in attempting to remove the Jews from Israel and in attempting to take Jerusalem. And as a result, the wheat will be threshed and the chaff will be blown away. And with the judgments in Israel complete, the Jews will once again start returning to Israel and the preparation will begin for the establishment of the Messiah's temple and throne in Jerusalem. And this will lead to a time when all kings and all nations will ultimately come to serve Christ, who will establish a kingdom of peace, which will begin in Israel and over time extend throughout the entire world. And again, the prophets and the Psalms give us insights into just what this kingdom will look like. He shall come down like rain upon mown grass, says Psalm 72, talking of Christ and his effect of peace on the earth, as showers that water the earth. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him. So the kingdom of Christ will be one that is characterised by morality and justice, loving kindness and mercy. It will be a kingdom which characterises, where the characteristics of God will be manifested, where the knowledge of the glory of God will fill the earth. And Micah 4, which has already featured in some of our quotes tonight on Armageddon, says that after that time, many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the Lord Almighty has spoken." And so the role of Christ as universal king will be to arbitrate between the nations. He will settle disputes at every level, from personal, individual issues to geopolitical problems which may arise, and he will do this with a multitude of immortal saints. And of course, these quotes about peace are all part of the prophecies about Armageddon, which begin with Israel returning to the land and ultimately end with Armageddon, the final phase of these prophecies, as we find, is the peace that ultimately follows that. And that process of judgment before peace is depicted in the prophets. In the reading we had tonight, we find the nations beating their ploughshares into swords and their pruning hooks into spears. It's a symbol of the nations anticipating and preparing for war. And by the time Armageddon is completed and Christ has destroyed the armies of the invading forces, Micah then describes how those weapons of war will once again be dismantled and turned into agricultural instruments. Perhaps one of the best prophetic illustrations comes from the New Testament from words spoken by Christ. Prior to the coming of Christ in Luke 21, we have the symbolic roaring of the sea and the waves. And that symbol of a state of the nations being in turmoil prior to the coming of Christ is what the sea and the waves is talking about. And Isaiah uses that same terminology in the latter-day context. And by the time we come to Revelation chapter 4, the nations have been conquered, the world is in a state of peace, and that peace is symbolised by a sea of water, which is as still as glass. And so where in Luke and Isaiah the roaring of the waves and the sea represent the constant state of international turmoil and upheaval that characterises the kingdom of men, the sea of glass in Revelation represents a kingdom of peace and serenity under the reign of Christ. What a powerful illustration that is. When we look at the world today and the chaos that is charting an exponential rise, when we look at the fear that is being generated by Russia, when we look at militant extremism and the breakdown of world unions which were intended to establish peace, the threats of a financial crisis, the light at the end of the tunnel is fading away very quickly. And soon this world will be a very dark place. And while we can see all of this happening around us, we can also take assurance from the Word of God that as surely as Israel has returned to their land, this world which is now being drawn into Armageddon will ultimately experience peace under the reign of Christ.